Arrivederci. Prego. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to see Minister Giovannini, an old friend for many years. I'd like to thank Professor Tartaglia and the organizing committee for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here for many reasons, not just because Torino is a beautiful city, but because it was the birthplace of our founder, Aurelio Pesce, who was in many ways a pioneer, an innovator, a revolutionary of bringing together industry, scientists, economists, financial people to think about, in a collective manner, the future of humanity. And it is his legacy which the Club of Rome represents, and it is a very important legacy in today's world where no single individual discipline, whether it be engineering, science, economics, banking, philosophy, can make it alone. We have to come together and look at the problems that we face and the issues that we must address in a collective and interdisciplinary and ultimately a transdisciplinary way. And I think it was Aurelio Pesce, the founder of the Club of Rome, who really led that way 40 years or 45 years ago. The Club of Rome is an unusual alliance. It was set up, as I mentioned, by Aurelio Pesce and someone called Alexander King, a Scotsman who was a scientist, so a businessman and a scientist. And their goal was to understand the predicament of mankind, the future of humanity. And the concerns at that time were population growth, feeding the world, and damaging our environment. To a very large degree, those are still issues of concern. The first book that was produced 41 years ago was called Limits to Growth. And it made the obvious point that if you have a stock of natural resources or natural capital and you deplete it, ultimately you will run out of those resources. But during that journey, you will find that the cost of those resources will start increasing because it just is more costly. And when you do that, you will find that economic growth is impaired and ultimately will be affected. The most recent book is called Plundering the Planet. It's in German at the moment, but will be translated into several languages. And that is by our Club of Rome member, Professor Ugo Bardi, who I'm delighted to say is here with us today and was a member of the organizing committee. It has become a major seller in Germany. It had an amazing reaction. Limits to Growth really portrayed a number of issues. It didn't make predictions, but what it did was look at systems analysis, and we are returning to looking at systems of problems, and that's where the scientific community has a comparative advantage, because it does think in terms of systems. We also look at the long term, and that again is a prerogative of science and scientists. They look at the long term, sometimes the very long term, if you're a geologist. Today we have about 100 members and 30 national associations around the world, and our primary financier, interestingly enough, is from China, and China is very keen to discuss and debate many of the issues facing not only China but the world. So why have we in a way rebuilt the Club of Rome? The answer, I think, is we are at an inflection point in global affairs. In the past few decades, we've seen the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, particularly China. We've seen the collapse of the Soviet Empire. We've seen massive shifts in global communications technology. We've seen massive deregulation, especially of the energy and finance industry, not always with positive results in my view. We've seen the rise of globalization, where capital has no boundaries whatsoever. We've seen the rise in environmentalism, both at the local, regional, and global level. And we've seen, I think, a rise globally in our collective social conscience, our concern over global poverty. But I equally think there is a new search, a new paradigm, a new journey for many of us, and it is the search for a new wisdom. Religion, political ideology have not captured the imagination with today's generation that it did previously. We have to search, it seems to me, for a universal conscience, philosophically, for a new globalized world and a very different world that is highly interconnected. And what I'd like to do in my talk is take a very global look at the issues that I think will need addressing, and then talk about some of the areas where it does need addressing. And what I hope you will see is that it is bringing together the issues of science and evidence-based systems to the more normative discussion on values and economics and finance. I think there have been 5 warning signs over the past decade, 2 decades. The first and most important in my view, even more important than perhaps the environmental one, has been work, jobs, employment. Global, regional and local unemployment are high and rising. The International Labour Organization has now recorded the highest ever number of unemployed people, and that's formally unemployed, at about 300 million, with perhaps 1 billion people, 1,000 million people underemployed. We have 1.7 billion people under the age of 15, and that is going to be the greatest resource we inherit or the greatest risks we take on. That is up to us. We are seeing a healthier and older population wanting to work, and the nature of jobs is changing dramatically. There is also a massive labor substitution by technology. This is occurring faster than has ever done historically. And even in the poorest countries, in Africa, and even in the most labor-intensive sectors, such as agriculture, labor substitution is occurring. So how we aspire to provide full and meaningful and remunerative work for those coming into the workplace in the next 10, 20, 30 years remains, in my view, perhaps the biggest global issue we will confront. The second major issue is an obvious one. It is our ecological crises. We've seen the fastest loss of forest cover, about 1 acre per second, the size of Greece every year. It has slowed down somewhat recently, but it nevertheless is at an all-time high. We've seen the depletion of oceans and fish stocks in serious condition in many parts of the world. What has happened in agriculture over 5,000 years of moving from hunter-gatherer to farmer is happening over about 50 years in our seas, from hunter-gatherer fishing to fish farming, with unknown and potentially, I think, damaging ecological problems. We've seen industrial pollution rise, but then fall in many countries. I think there's a good story there. And we're seeing increasingly water stress, water scarcity in many countries. I was at a meeting last week in Barcelona discussing water scarcity, and it was an interesting discussion because we talked of 3 types of scarcity: physical, biophysical scarcity, which was science and evidence-based, but also economic scarcity, where the cost of securing water was rising, and financial scarcity, where the funding and financial resources could not be mobilized to meet the economic needs as a result of the biophysical analysis. This was a case where science, economics, and finance needed to be more aligned. And of course, climate change. I will not spend a lot of time on climate change. It would be worth an hour's lecture on its own, I think. But we do know that the climate is changing. We do have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change findings, which have just come out on Working Group 1, which are very clear that global warming is a clear and present danger, and that the evidence that is produced suggests that it is anthropogenic. It is people, it is us who are changing our climate. There has been a modest slowdown in temperature rise over the last decade, but that is as part of a long-term trend. We are seeing temperatures rising. And we may well note in the next few decades the massive changes in weather conditions, in drought, in weather, in floods, etc., that come from a changing climate and massively changing weather systems. We've also seen a food commodity crisis over the last 10 years, 2 major spikes in food prices, possibly suggesting to us that globally our food is too cheap, not too expensive, and that we can anticipate in the next few years, in my view, or the next few decades, a major rise and a sustained rise in the cost of food. The cost of water is increasing, and the competition for land is increasing. The 2 spikes, the very big spikes in commodity prices of food, put an additional 75 to 100 million were pushed below the poverty line for the period when the prices were very high. They've since fallen somewhat. So it is a real wake-up call that managing our agricultural and food systems is essential to get them aligned with the real values of the inputs, but also in managing them as a commodity. There's also been a sense that as food became a commodity, a financial asset class, speculators came in, and speculators were buying food they would never receive and selling it to people who would never receive it also. They were the intermediate people who were in the financial sector, who are helping drive the price of food up. Fourth, we've seen a financial and banking crisis. You're all familiar with this, driven initially by the United States subprime crisis, which produced high levels of liquidity and irresponsible banking. And while deregulation provided a mystifying array of new financial products, derivatives, hedge funds, etc., and a communications boom in speed meant that the financial transactions were on the basis of nanosecond. Currently, for example, we trade $4 trillion a day in currency trades. It's a staggering amount, and it's not done by humans, it's done by people who've designed algorithms for computers. It's done in nanoseconds. And 5, we've seen and have with us an enduring poverty crisis. Perhaps 1.5 to 2 billion people poor by any standards in the world, and perhaps 1 billion of those in absolute poverty. And this has improved. The Millennium Development Goals that Minister Giovannini spoke about earlier have indeed been achieved. We've made good progress, but that progress has been largely due to one country, China. Has really been about 80% of that improvement. Africa still remains left behind. Many parts of Asia outside of China still are left behind. There are 3 features that I want to mention of those 5 of those crises. The first is they are all linked. A financial crisis is also a climate change crisis. If you don't have the money to invest in new technology, you won't address the climate crisis. I mentioned the food crisis was also a financial and banking crisis. The poverty crisis is an environmental crisis also. They are linked. And when these things are linked, and you heard about the networks and the complexity of networks earlier this morning, when they are linked, there's a very good chance that what is driving them are the same root causes, the same issues are driving these changes. The second is they are all anthropogenic. That is to say, they are all induced by us. All of those crises have been human-induced. It is not only climate change that is anthropogenic. It is indeed many of these other crises. And they are not part of some inalienable laws of nature. Our economics crisis is not because economics is Newtonian science. It's because we have done the wrong economics to address the problems. And the third feature, I think, is that there is a great deal that science has to offer in terms of evidence-based changes, whether it is to our natural systems, our climate, or to our food systems. It seems to me we have systematically underinvested in science over the last number of years. It is not that science will cure everything, but science is the bedrock upon which enlightened economic and public policy can be made. And it seems to me that's something that is very important as we look forward. But let me stop for a moment and talk a little bit about the future, perhaps to the middle of the century, when many of you in this room will still be working, I suspect. Some of us won't be around, but many will. And just take a moment to think about the future, say to 2050, not very far away. We anticipate our population, which passed 7 billion last year, will probably reach 8.5 to 9 billion, perhaps 10 billion. It depends on on the various estimates that are made. But either way, we will be adding 1.5 billion to 2 billion people onto planet Earth. That's a lot of people. We will see a demographic change also, that the 80-20 split, 80% of the world's population has 20% of the GDP, of the income and assets. 20% of the population, us, the rich world, owns about 80%. That will shift over time, particularly as we see the rise of China, India, Brazil particularly. But even in Africa, we're beginning to see economic growth. And it will probably lay out at about 60-40. What's really important on the population change is not just the absolute numbers, but it is how many people we are adding each year to what could be thought of as the middle class, the middle income. People like us with our aspirations, with our consumer habits, with our energy consumption habits, our food consumption habits. 75 to 100 million people, that's at the lower end, a country larger than Italy, is added every year to the middle class. That's a staggering figure. In India, the middle income, the middle class, is larger than the whole of Europe. So it's a very, very big increment to consumption and production habits. And that's something that will have to be looked at, I think. If we look at this demographic change and the per capita income growth, we can make some assumptions about future demand. Food is going to double. Food demand will double by 2050. It'll be driven by per capita income, as I've mentioned, which is shifting diets. India, for example, we used to always think of as a religiously vegetarian country. Livestock demand in India is doubling every 5 years now. We're beginning to see that as per capita incomes rise, people's diets change, and the demand for meat products changes dramatically. And of course, there will be additional 1.5 billion mouths to feed, and an additional 1 billion people who don't eat enough today. They don't consume enough. So the demands on our food system will be very large. To give you some sense also, it takes about 7 kilos of grain to produce 1 kilo of meat. So the trace through of the meat demand on both land and grains is huge. And it takes about 7,000 litres of water to produce 1 kilo of meat. So the water demand and the land demand and the demand on our agricultural systems will be great. We anticipate energy perhaps tripling, depending on whether you think of energy in terms of energy units or in terms of the money that you will need, because there is a lot of vintage stock that will have to be replaced, particularly in the Western world. But we anticipate somewhere around a 2.5 to 3-fold increase in energy. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have to look for jobs. Looking for jobs, meaningful work, and new definitions of work even, for the 2 billion people who will be under 15 at that point in time, is going to be a great challenge, and it's one that we must rise to. Third area is that global GDP, which is the measure of the goods and services that was spoken about earlier this morning, currently is somewhere around $70 trillion. It depends on how it's calculated, whether it's power purchasing parity, whether it's real income, etc. And that will probably rise to about 200 to 250 trillion by 2050. It is, of course, an exponential issue, which was the great genius of the limits to growth. It taught people about exponential rises, which I think very often people don't focus on. But we're looking at a major shift of goods and services being put on planet Earth between now and the middle of the century. It'll be in terms of infrastructure, transport, housing, energy needs, water needs, etc. We've seen a somewhat of a downturn in global GDP, but the slowdown still produces about a 3% GDP per annum, somewhat lower per capita annum. So let me turn now to what can we do. The first is we can discuss and debate the issues. I think there is a real opening of imagination, an opening of vision for people to say, yes, we have a global planetary issue, set of problems, we need to start addressing them. I wouldn't discourage that debate. I think it's very, very good. We're seeing the debate starting on our common future, not in parliaments. Parliaments and the politicians are behind the curve. It is civil society, it is student bodies, it is people discussing these issues in other fora that I'm beginning to become very optimistic that we will start addressing many of these challenges. Our politicians, it seems to me, are behind the curve. If I look at climate change in particular, I think the civil society is way ahead of the thinking of politicians. I think travel has broadened our experience and concerns. And I think there's been a moral outrage, certainly in my own country, at the excesses of our financial system. It really is hard to imagine how any single individual could earn a bonus, as someone did in 2010 in New York, of $4.5 billion, and in a world where we see starvation. So the moral outrage of a financial sector and a banking sector that has become out of control and must be really managed seems to me to be very important. So I do think there is an important inflection point where we are changing our thinking and changing our debate. And this is where we like to think the Club of Rome, with my colleagues such as Ugo and others, and as Minister Giovannini said, he was co-opted onto the Club of Rome by myself and has done really been very helpful to us. I think the debate is starting, and it's how do we galvanize it. I'm going to start suggesting 2 or 3 areas where I think we need to change. And the first one is perhaps the unusual one, but it is the one that scientists many years ago against, for example, the atomic bomb, it was scientists who formed coalitions around values and morals. And so I think we have to have not just a scientific, technical, economic, financial debate, we must have a moral debate, a values debate about what sort of society we all want to create for us and our children. Parliaments used to debate these issues many, many years ago. Now parliaments just look at short-termism and what they can do to get into to keep their seats in Parliament. And I think what we have to focus on is what kind of world do we want, not what kind of world will we get, and then what changes do we make to it. We have to have that debate. And in the Club of Rome, we've started something called Values Quest, the quest for values for the 21st century. And these include a number of areas that I think are important. One is the intertemporal. Do we care about future generations? How much do we really care about our children, their children, and their children? We care a lot about our children, but what about future generations? Second one that I think is fundamental to the debate, the philosophical debate, is are we a part of or are we a part from nature? Are we an integral part of our natural systems, the natural biological systems that we see around us, or are we somehow separate and a colonizer of those? That relationship with nature was something we never had to debate over the last 300 years because it never was a pressing issue. But today, I think it is. What is our right relationship between humanity and the natural systems that support us and are essential to our well-being? To what extent do we have a social conscience that moves across borders? How much do we really care about the billion people who are in poverty? And a final one, which I think is a very important one for the scientific community and the economics community to come together, is what is our value and tolerance towards risk and uncertainty? When we see risks, do we hide from them or do we go forward proactively and deal with them? I think climate change is at that point where the debate about risk is terribly important. It is a values debate, not just a technical debate. The second big issue that we have to confront is we simply have the wrong economic system for today's world, and certainly we have the wrong economic system for tomorrow's world. We have got to reshift our thinking about economy and not get tied into thinking that economics, unlike the physical sciences that was spoken about earlier, are somehow Newtonian science where laws are given and they must be obeyed. Economics is a practical art form, not an immutable science. So we've got to look at an economy that reduces and eliminates waste to become much more efficient. To give examples, in the food systems we have, we waste 1/3 of all food that we produce. We completely waste 1/3. In some countries it's 40%. In the rich world we waste it because it's so cheap we buy far too much of it and throw it away. I was looking at an interesting example of a supermarket in the UK called Tesco's, which has just announced that it's going to start managing its lettuce and salads because they waste 2/3 of all the salads they bring. They bring them from Spain by truck with a huge carbon footprint. They store them in refrigeration and then they throw 2/3 of it away. It's astonishing. So we've got to become more efficient, and there are many ways we can do that. In the developing world wastes 1/3 of its food. Sometimes in Africa 40%, almost 50%. And that's because of poor storage. Post-harvest losses can be massive. So we've got to become more efficient and less wasteful. We've got to look at how an economy can create jobs. The way we think about employment and jobs at the moment is we must get GDP growth. We must absolutely get GDP growth. Then we look at the impact of that growth. Then we'll adjust that impact. And one of the impacts is, did it create jobs? Why not start with the premise that we must have full employment and then look at what an economic system would have to do to deliver that? It's a fundamental rethink of our economic principles, it seems to me. Third, we must value the importance of nature and natural capital to our planet. We undervalue the role of nature, and yet it plays a powerful role. Without water and air, we cannot survive. Yet why is it that we're depleting the quality of air around the world with climate change? And why is it are we moving maybe 30 to 40 countries into dramatic water-scarce countries? Because we're depleting the water resources, largely because it's free, largely because nobody pays for the water. I mean, somebody does, but it has a long-term impact. We have got to understand that our natural capital is every bit as important as our other forms of capital. And we've got to restore the link between the real economy and the financial and banking sector to become a viable economy. In the example I gave about the $4 trillion of currency exchanges that occur every day in the world, there was a study done by a former Club of Rome member called Hazel Henderson that analyzed this and came to the conclusion that basically not 1 cent of that 4 trillion made its way into the real economy. There were 1 or 2 people who made a lot of money, but it didn't create jobs. It didn't create the investment and the productive investment we needed. So we have to tie in the link between our financial and banking sector and the real economy. There are many ways we can do that, and I don't have time to discuss that now, but that is a priority, it seems to me. I won't go through all of the details on how we might do that, but I do think we have to reform fiscal and taxation policy. For example, most countries, when you tax something, it's because you want less of it. And when you don't tax it or you subsidize it, because you want more of it. Why is it we subsidize the depletion of energy and natural resources on the one hand and tax labor? Don't we want more jobs and more efficiency? It seems to me we've got our pendulum over here and we need to bring it back and make it more level. I think that's going to be a serious issue in the next number of years. Taxing the depletion so that we deplete our natural resource base less, and not taxing labor so businesses can take on more people. I think it's going to be a very big issue. We're going to have to reform our markets to make them more transparent and make them deliver the goods and services society needs, not the goods and services 1 or 2 bankers and financial analysts seem to need. We're going to have to shift our production process and our consumption behaviors, as I've mentioned, and we're going to have to manage the next round of global public goods on Doha, with agriculture, on climate change, and increasingly on water treaties. To do this, we'll not only need new values and a new economic thinking, new economic philosophy, if you like. We'll also need new types of governance, new institutions that are much more stakeholder-made, institutions that bring the range of actors together, the scientific community, the economists, the financial people, bankers, teachers, and others. And we need the kind of leadership at the global level that we simply do not have. The United Nations is our best bet at the moment, but any of you who've attended United Nations meetings where they reach consensus, the consensus typically is the least committed country agreeing with the least interested country, and then everybody applauds it. We can do better, and we must do better. There's a famous quote from someone called James Clark in which he said, "A politician thinks of the next election, a statesman of the next generation." And we need that kind of thinking, it seems to me. So I do think we have our challenges ahead, but we can address them. We can address them through many of the areas I've spoken about. We will need new alliances of the kind I've spoken about. I'm delighted that the theme of this meeting is how do we bring science and public policy together. Interestingly enough, in the UK there was a survey done about who were the most trusted people in the UK. You can gather that politicians were not high on the list, neither were lawyers, neither were bankers. The number one was scientists. It was the science community has in a sense re-established itself as a place of trust. And I think that's terribly important, because if you are evidence-based and you make the case, then you can be listened to. So I think the scientific community has a special place in which it can start the process of bringing in economics and finance, but it cannot do it alone. It's no good the scientists telling us that water is scarce if nobody's going to come in and say, well, we need to value it in order to make sure we allocate it correctly. And there's no good then the economists feeling good if the financials and the banking sector doesn't come in and say, well, we're going to finance and invest in the water to get the optimal investment to make sure that people can get the water they need in a manner that makes sense. And that will require new institutions. I think there's a huge role for third parties, for independent judgment by transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary groups. But perhaps above all, I think we need a new morality, a new ethos, a new vision of what our global society will look like. Every single one of you in this room is not only an Italian national or a Torino citizen, you're a global citizen. What you do affects the outside world, and what happens in the outside world affects you, and that will only intensify over the next number of years. So we have to have a new global compass that reflects all of our global citizenship. We live in an era that many scientists have called Anthropocene. This started about 150, 200 years ago, and it is the claim is it's a new geological era. And it is the geological era where humanity and human beings are shaping the world. Prior to that, they really didn't. And the question is, can we shape it for the better or for the worse? And it is my view, by bringing alliances together, by putting pressure on governments for change of the kind I've spoken about, that the scientists, economists, politicians, teachers and others can indeed move our planet back to equilibrium, to a more efficient planet, to a fairer planet, and to one where we can live within the bounds of our natural systems and the natural capital that supports us. And I would like to thank you very much for the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. Adesso è il tempo di domande e risposte con il Dr. Johnson o con il professor Tartaglia. Se qualcuno vuole porre un quesito.
I should say that my knowledge of Italian is limited to my trips to Rome very often to watch rugby and watch the Italian the rugby team, but I don't have good Italian, I'm afraid.
Teniamo anche presente che oggi pomeriggio alle 3 c'è una tavola rotonda pubblica in cui la discussione sarà il sale dell'evento. C'è qualche domanda? Se non ci sono domande, allora chiudiamo. Lassù, Matteo Pavese, altro mio adepto del DISAT. Se vuoi venire qua, così... Ciao.
I wanted to ask you something about the role of scientists in all these things you said. I mean, I see too many times that science now is becoming a religion too. I mean, people are believing without knowing what they are believing. So we scientists tell the people things are like this or things are like that. After that, people believe. So, well, we don't have so many people understanding exactly what happens. And then the problem I was wondering, and I would like to know what you think about this, Bob, is how can we avoid people telling anything they have in mind or something they are paid to tell? I mean, there are a lot of scientists that tell things that I paid to tell and not that they feel the reality. So, I mean, it's a big matter, I think, of the moral for the people like us who make research.
Thank you very much. I think it's a really important point you make, actually. I think not just scientists, I would say education has become very compartmentalized. So if you go to study economics, all you do is study economics. Many years ago, there was the notion of a first-year education at university, which was very, very broad. It encompassed moral philosophy, and it was all about the ability to think for yourself. And I think we've lost that. And I've been speaking actually in the University of Geneva with colleagues there who are thinking of maybe introducing what we've sort of called a global citizenship basis, where no matter whether you're going to study medicine, engineering, economics, a foundation of thinking is really essential, it seems to me. And the more we've spoken to students, the more, I would say, enthusiastic they are for, having something that would put everyone on the same platform of their understanding of the nature of the world they live in and will live in. So I think it's a really important point. And I do think, I certainly in my own country, education has become very, very narrowly compartmentalized. And I think that's a mistake, frankly. So it's an important point you've made, I think.
Ci sono altre domande? Prego, si accomodi qua e schiaccia il pulsante.
So thank you. Both you and Tartaglia mentioned the word governance and the subject of governance. So I wanted to ask you to develop a little bit in deep this question, because I mean, I was wondering, yes, the governance is important, but which kind of governance? For example, international organizations like UN and so on have in some, in some ways some powers to govern the processes are changing the world, but finally that's a question of power also. So what you can do, what we can do. Thank you.
Grazie. Iniziamo col professor Tartaglia.
Well, I'll answer in English, so since the question is both of us. The problem of governance is really difficult in a sense that there is something we can say on the technical and scientific side. I evidence the fact that in any case we must think to a reorganization of the even positive management of power, because it is not really possible to have the control of all the system worldwide, because it is too big in a sense. There is some critical size which identifies the units that can be self-governed in a sense, and then you need to have a cooperation between different cells, units, or whatever. Well, this is some rational analysis of the situation, and it is just to eliminate the illusion that anybody can have a unique rule, a unique governance somewhere, deciding for the best in all of the world. Once we say this, we have now many institutions that have responsibilities in order to recover a right and reasonable interaction with the physical constraints. Of course, we cannot do much at the micro scale. We can do many things, and people are trying to do something good, even at the small scales. But it is true that you need a scale which is not the global one and not the purely local one. I mean, it is evident that policies what I say, control the growth mechanism should be at least at the scale of Europe now, here in this continent. The positive policies in just one country are not possible because we are interrelated. There is nothing to do. Even if we want to do something which is positive and rational, etc., and all the rest of this continent is doing the contrary, it won't work. There's nothing to do. We are interrelated. The network is global. It's actually global. So scale, it's at least the continental scale. But we have the need of coordinating policies at the worldwide scale, and we have the institution to do so. These institutions have usually they have no direct power to impose something to anybody. Well, they can try, but well, the biggest countries are not so easy to to control, to well, influence. But they can do much because they can just coordinate policies, positive policies. Well, I completely agree on the fact that a global awareness must be stressed and impartially built. It is already there, which is on the scientific side. Of course, the real problem is how to make ratio, the reason, human reason, and rational decisions enter the short-term arena, which is typical of politics. This is the problem. I have no answer, actually. I have no answer. But I'm confident that if we multiply the opportunities where scientifically we analyze what is going on, and what Professor Giovannini was saying, well, it is not just to think to the future. Think to now, yes, of course, but you know that now is endangered because of what we know about the future. So you think for today, of course, yes, today. But we know what is going to happen even in our life, not only in the next generations. I'm confident that something will, in the end, will happen. There is also a possible fatalist version of what I'm saying. And I know that some people have this fatalist attitude. I exchanged messages with at the beginning with people of the former Club of Rome, I mean of the authors of the Limits to Growth. And well, the feeling of many of them, for instance, Meadows, was that, well, there are some times, typical times, you can compress them more than that. You know now, scientifically know that something bad is coming if we do not correct our way of thinking and of managing the problems. But the inertia of the system is so big that, well, we can change something when it is possible to do so, hopefully before the final crash, but people really get convinced of the fact that you have to do something just after they have tried and experienced bad results from their actual daily way of life. So a bit of disaster, someone is thinking, a bit of disaster is needed if we want to become wise. Well, I hope it is not so, literally so, but indeed, with times we cannot control, the situation is already changing.
Actually, I feel that we are already experiencing some more than a bit of disaster with this in these very moments of crisis. Please.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a lot of governance change going on. Sometimes, you know, one interesting one is the G8 to the G20. That was a signal that you could no longer leave out China, for example, as part of international discussions. So I think we're going to see shifts of power bases over the next 10 years that will be more reflective of the rise, particularly of the developing world. I do think there's huge scope for third party, for independent, trusted bodies. I think we moved the climate change agenda forward precisely because of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which had a degree of independence. In my own country, they're experimenting with something called a natural capital board, a semi-independent board that will look at the use of natural capital and its value in the UK. Central banks have played a sort of independent role. I think the Fed, for example, plays a positive role of being a relatively trusted institution. So I think there's a way in which we need more of these sorts of third parties. I think also in the private sector, we will move ultimately to shareholders and stakeholders, because what the private sector does is to produce private goods and public goods, and it needs to have the protection that the public good is there. So I think there's a lot of institutional innovation that will come about in the next number of years that will shift much more towards broader stakeholders and degrees of political independence from political interference. The final one, I think, is one that we could really think about, which is in parliaments, national parliaments, it would be possible for one part of the parliament to be, people to be elected to serve longer terms as global representatives dealing with the global issues. And I think that's something that would be a very creative next step in parliamentary processes. You would not just have parliamentarians for your constituency, you'd have some who would represent you on issues. Obviously, it'd be a smaller number, but perhaps 5 to 10% of a parliament. So I think there's a lot of institutional innovation that we could do. Our problem is we're stuck with a very conservative status quo when it comes to political change and institutional change, and that will need a lot of work, it seems to me.
Yeah, thank you. Ci sono altre domande? Vieni pure, purtroppo costringiamo delle mezze maratone i nostri.
So, considering the geopolitical and global issues that we'd like to solve, I'd like to ask you, what should be the role of science? I mean, good, shared, not competitive-based science on data sharing and net neutrality, and how science can influence policies and governance. And that's. Thanks.
You're giving me all the difficult questions, I see. First, I think your point about increasing collaboration, I think that's essential. I worked on something called the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which developed and has developed about 600,000 accessions on plants and livestock, all of which is free, is in the public domain. I think we have to look at research that goes into the public domain must go into the global public domain. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for much more shared collaboration of these kinds of consultative scientific groups, of which the one I'm most familiar with is agriculture. I think secondly is the role of scientists is to make sure that what they do is evidence-based. And you have a history of peer review, which I think is a very strong one that's not often understood by the general public. And I think moving towards more peer-reviewed documentation, such as what the IPCC does. I know there are criticisms of the IPCC. It's sometimes not as current as it should be, but it does offer the general public a trusted, evidence-based analysis. And I think more and more transparency and making sure you do everything in your power to demonstrate that it is trusted, evidence-based is very, very important. Then people will listen to scientists very much, it seems to me. They won't listen to financial people or bankers anymore, but I think there's a good chance that they will with scientists. I think the great danger is when science gets mixed so much with industry that it becomes proprietary and a trade issue. That does complicate matters somewhat. But where there's collaboration on what we might think of as public goods, climate change, water resource management, forest depletion, where you will benefit even if the actions take place outside your country, in my view, much more developed collaboration and systems of scientific collaboration should be encouraged, with a clear understanding of what you do with the intellectual property rights that come out of that.
Thank you.